Hey folks, welcome to Tyrdom. So, the day is finally here. Let's start to discuss how the Christianing of the Northern world, how it came to be, and try to venture into the reason why it became the way it is today. So, one thing that I want to debunk here at the get-go is that some people tend to think that the Christians just waltzed into the northern society and filled sort of a spiritual vacuum. And let me be the one to tell you that this is a fallacy, an absolute fallacy. Because in the old Nordic world, it was a very high degree of spirituality going around. And there was no spiritual vacuum. Rather, everything had a meaning, if that makes sense. If you came into the realm of the forest, there were different types of deities there. The Vettirs and the trolls and the land spirits. But it was also a world with archetypical understandings. For example, the concept of sacrifice was well known long before the Bible was a thing in the Nordics. And it was a well understood fact that the gods also suffered, just like the humans did in Midgård. And also that wisdom had a price. So these were now novel concepts to the Iron Age Nordic peoples at all. But I think that the real question here is something like, what did they recognize in Christ when it all panned out? And I think in order for us to understand this, we need to look at an older sacred world, because it was indeed a sacred world back then. And I think that the meeting between paganism and Christianity must begin with a little expose of time. And because in the north, the sacred was already existing and it was ancient. It had been around for a long, long time, way longer than the narrative of Jesus Christ even existed. And I think it's easy to forget the time scales of these things sometimes. And, long time before any churches were erect in Scandinavia, people lived in mythic landscapes that were created by their ancestors over sometimes thousands of years. And like I mentioned before, spirits and gods were intimately tied to the rhythms of nature, like I so oftentimes talk about here. It was more of an animistic spirituality, you could say, and not as dogmatic as the Abrahamic religions tend to be. And I would say that the Norse tradition was not necessarily the beginning of all this. It was a later expression, because the frameworks of these belief systems has been around for a very, very long time. I've talked about the Indo-Europeans before, and they likely came with this at the time when the ice melted in the Nordics. And I think there's a lot of concepts around the Indo-Europeans, and it's believed that they had these mythic patterns that has that's been around since then. Sorry about that. The whole concept of the Sky Father, for example, or and the Sky Father, by the way, some scholars believe that today's or Iron Age Tyr was actually the original Sky Father, which is partially why I'm calling this channel Tyrdom, because it's believed that he was one of the initial gods, of the gods, so to speak. But there were also concepts of the Thunderer, meaning the precursor to today's Thor. And the Indo-Europeans also had a notion of the cosmic axis, so to speak. And they also had a belief about the cycle of death and renewal. These are very animistic traits that has been around for a long, long time. And I think by the time the Gospels were written, these structures were already way older than memory itself in the North. And the Christian story, however, is very novel in this context, very novel. And the archetypes that Christianity brought with them were nothing new to the Scandinavians or the Northerners. And now it's when it starts to get really interesting, I would say. Because let's talk about the Christ on the cross for a second. So I think that the heart of this is in this clash of paganistic beliefs and Christianity is the notion of a very powerful imagery. And the whole notion of Christ hanging on the cross is about the God who sacrifices himself, right? And in the Old Norse society, this was a very well-known story, because Odin, as most of you know, hanged himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree. And he did it by piercing himself with a spear. And this was an absolute way to deny himself the comforts. And he was basically suspended in the realm between life and death. And he, according to the stories, sacrificed himself to gain the knowledge of the runes and the knowledge to bridge the worlds, so to speak. And I think this was not a metaphor for Odin's weakness. It was rather a metaphor for the cosmic initiation, if that makes sense. The God who suffers, you could say. And that wisdom made it so he could enter the world. And just like Jesus, he hanged himself as a sacrifice to gain something. And there are traits in these stories that are a bit too similar to be seen as coincidences, I would say. And then there's another example of the self-sacrificing gods. And it's about the god that loses his hand. And of course, this is Tyr. So Tyr is oftentimes depicted as the god of law, order, and courage. And he sacrificed his hand to the Fenris wolf. And this was not done in battle nor in rage. It was a way of him binding an oath. and by extension saving humanity from Ragnarök. And even though this is not the martyrdom we can see in Christianity, it's something very closely related to this. It's the willingness to lose a part of yourself so that the world does not collapse into chaos, basically. So again, very, very similar notion of the sacrifice. And I think that having all this said, these are just a few examples of this, but these are well-known examples. I think this made it that these concepts weren't foreign for the Norse or the Northerners. It was rather something foundational. And since it was foundational, it was actually easier for them to accept it. And I think if we look at Christianity in a historical time, you know, centuries later came the story of Christ. And a man in first century Judea, I think it's called in English, but then executed by the Romans. And over time, this transformed into the theological global faith that we see today, even though Christianity has also changed quite dramatically over the years, of course. And I think that the church and the doctrine and the theology in large, all of it developed long after the mythical foundations that I've laid out here just a moment ago. And this made it that it was a pretty low friction thing to put Christ into the already polytheistic pantheon of gods, if that makes sense, because they recognize the patterns of the self-sacrificing God that either sacrificed his hand for the cosmic balance or sacrificed himself with the spear on the world tree to gain knowledge. And when it all came to the Nordics, all they saw, the folks here, was a younger expression of it. But you could just as add it to the pantheon of gods without any real friction, you know. And I think that, again, if we look at the pattern recognition here, I think it cannot be understated that Christ hanged on the cross, like everyone know, wounded by a spear and abandoned and suspended between worlds. You know, this is not at all unfamiliar for the Norse peoples. And to a culture that already knew Odin's ordeals, this was not an incomprehensive symbolism, you know. And I think that it was a very familiar structure, all in all, just expressed in a different language. So from the eyes of the North, I think that they looked at Christ as an all-suffering all-father, if that makes sense. And somewhat of a divine character which sacrifice sustains order, much like Tyr, or a god whose death opens a path after death. And this is not at all so different from the connection between the living and the dead with Yggdrasil and the world tree. So I don't think it's not necessarily, it could be a case for a rebirth of Odin necessarily, but it's basically the same story when push comes to shove. And it's a pattern that was already present in their everyday lives and celebrations, and in the northern imagination, if you will. And I think that the reason why this conversion, air quote, was possible, I've mentioned this before. To me, when I read about it, the main driver behind the Christianing of the North was political. That's just the cut dry explanation. But it was also a tool for power, because you have to understand that even though paganism was something everyone did, it wasn't formed as rigid as the Abrahamic religions. It was not dogmatic in that sense. And this made it hard to control people. However, Christians are easier to control because they have one leader and one way of conduct. So this fact cannot be ignored. So you have to understand that the people who Christianed the Northerners were priests, but also kings. And many times this Christianing was, like I said, it was something that was snuck in to the already broad pantheon of gods. Why not just add Christ, just to make sure? But then later on, it became something of a sword Christianing. And I know that especially in Norway, this was a thing. It was quite a violent time, and you better be Christian or else. We had those things in Sweden as well. But then we have Finland, which was one of the last countries in the whole north to be Christianized. And they fought diligently, the Christians, to Christian the pagan Finland. And I think that there's a deeper pattern to be seen here also. Across culture, this figure tends to show up again and again and again under different godlike names or synonyms. And it's the same story arc, if you will. The God who suffers, the God who descends, and the God who gives a part of himself so the world can endure. So these are not novel concepts. They are concepts way older than the Abrahamic scriptures. Odin on the tree, Tyr before the wolf, and Christ on the cross. They're all telling the same story, basically. And even though they're the same story, they are different stories. And they have different meanings, but the same underlying intuition, I would say, that transformation requires sacrifice. You know, in order to get something, you have to give something. Again, it's the animistic perspective. And I think that history often tells us that the conversion of the North was the fall of the Norse society. I don't necessarily agree with that notion. It was rather the rise of a new version of that society. And beneath all of this surface, the surface layer of the Christian world versus the pagan world, The sacred did not vanish. It didn't disappear. It's just translated itself to something else. And perhaps that is why the story of Christ could take root in the northern soul when push came to shove. And I think that because the people who heard about these stories, they already lived the story arc for centuries, all before the concept of the Bible and the scribes and the priests, with gods who bled and gods who gave and gods who understood that wisdom is never free. If you want to ascend, no matter how you do it, you need to sacrifice something. And I think that the Christian God was younger, but the pattern itself was ancient. And I think that when the Northerners looked at this cross, they did not see a foreign fate necessarily. They saw something that they always intrinsically knew about, and that the highest truths, they always are written in sacrifice. So that's my take on how the Nordics became Christian with time. This was not created from a vacuum. On the flip side, it was created in a very spiritually rich environment with all the same archetypes and stories, which made it all possible in the end of the day. Okay, folks, let me know what you think about it and let me know your takes on it. I'm interested to hear more. Okay, have a lovely day. Talk to you later. And as usual, cheer them out.